In the early morning hours of February 6, 2014, a van carrying 5 men finally came to a stop outside of a farm in Norway. After a miserable, nearly 15-hour drive, these 5 men who were from Finland were finally ready to begin their real adventure. They were going to be attempting one of the most dangerous underwater dives in the world. It is called the Traverse, and it is a 2-kilometer subsurface dive from one entrance of the Plur Cave to the other. The entrance they were going to start in was inside of the frozen pond next to this farm. 2 of the 5 men had actually done this so-called traverse before because they were the ones that discovered these 2 entrances were actually connected. But no amount of experience was going to limit the amount of physical risk they would have to take in order to complete this dive. The dive was so long, over 2 kilometers, that you actually needed a specialized underwater scooter that could propel you through the tunnel because you wouldn't be able to swim fast enough before you ran out of air. Which also meant if your scooter broke down in the middle of this pitch black underwater cave, you were screwed. The majority of the dive was going to be through this really tight tunnel where all along the ground were these limestone rocks that kind of poked up, where if you weren't careful, if you dragged your dry suit along them, you could tear it open. And then freezing water would go into your dry suit and you would die. Also, they were going to be using a diving rig known as a rebreather. So as a Navy SEAL, we used rebreathers. Basically, it takes your air and rebreathes it. So you're not breathing air into the water, you're breathing out into the system that scrubs your CO2 and then pumps it back into you. And you also combine that rebreathed air with pure oxygen, so you have a continuous cycle where you're just breathing pure oxygen. It makes for a really cool dive because you're looking around and there's no bubbles. But it's also very dangerous, and your body doesn't really adjust well to having pure oxygen pumped into it. In fact, you can be poisoned from pure oxygen, and when you're diving at depth with a rebreather, on the way up, you can't just rocket to the surface. There are these things called decompression stops along the way up, where depending on how long you were at a certain depth, you need to wait at certain stops along the way back up to the surface and let your body decompress. If you don't do that and you just rush to the surface, you can get something called the bends, which is decompression sickness, and it can be fatal. Not to mention, there's a couple other nasty side effects of using a rebreather, like if you get water inside of your breathing loop, it can actually get into the CO2 absorbent that sits inside of your rig, and that can cause this acidic mixture to go back into your mouth. But you can't take the mouthpiece out because more water will get into it and it'll flood your rig and then you'll just drown. So you need to just accept that there could be acid in your mouth, and you need to either get somebody else to give you their mouthpiece or get a standby rig and breathe off of that, because there's no solution to this. You just got to have acid in your mouth. Also, if you panic for any reason on a rebreather, you'll be breathing really heavy and your system will not be able to scrub the CO2 fast enough, and you'll have a buildup of CO2 in your body and you'll get hypercapnia, which can lead to disorientation and even passing out, which can be lethal underwater. This dive was famously dangerous to the point where the best divers in the world wouldn't attempt it. They called it a death wish. But these 5 divers from Finland were determined and they were eager to make the traverse. So shortly after they arrived, they take a quick nap and then they get up and they're ready to start the dive. They decided to break up into 2 groups. They had a pair that was going to go down first, and then 2 hours later, the other 3 would follow. Once the first pair was in the water, there would be no way to communicate between the 2 groups. So the pair cuts a triangle into the ice with a chainsaw, they hop into the beautifully clear water, and very quickly they start descending down into this tunnel. Once they got down to the tunnel, they turned on their scooters and started heading out. After a couple of hours, the pair reached the most dangerous part of the dive, where the tunnel basically nosedives and goes straight down to about 130 meters. And as you're going down, you have to be very cautious that you're going the right way, because there's all these dead end tunnels that look exactly like the way you're supposed to go, and they go pretty far out. But if you were to accidentally take a wrong turn and go down one of these dead man turns, you wouldn't have enough oxygen to complete the dive. So it's a slow process of making sure you go down the exact right path. And then when you get to the bottom at 130 meters, there was this plate that had been left there to signify you've gone the right way. And then you turn and go right back up again, and you're pretty much at the exit at that point. But it takes quite a while to cover that last little bit because there are necessary decompression stops along the way. The first group descended with no issues and didn't get sidetracked. They got to the bottom where that plate was. They turned and began going back up the ascent to their first decompression stop. The lead diver got through a particularly tight spot and then noticed that his partner behind him, his flashlight, which was normally right up against him, he couldn't see it anymore. And he turned and he saw that his partner had gotten wedged in this one section of the ascent. So the lead diver turns around and swims down to the trapped diver, who he can tell is panicking a little bit because he's trying to get himself free and he can't move. And the lead diver looks and he can tell that he is thoroughly wedged into this one little section. And the lead diver would say that what he thought happened is the trapped diver must have been going too quickly with his scooter and basically motorized himself into this wedge. Like it wouldn't have been humanly possible to swim fast or hard enough to get stuck as badly as he did. The lead diver could tell that he was totally stuck. There was probably no way he was going to get out of this. And so he tried taking some of his gear off, but they have such little space to work with, and the trap diver is starting to sense that this isn't going very well. And in a panic, he accidentally knocks his mouthpiece out of his mouth and can't find it again and ends up inhaling a bunch of water, and he dies. The lead diver knows that he can't panic because he will end up burning through his oxygen. He'll probably get hypercapnia. He won't be able to get to the surface and he'll die too. So he tries to free his friend's body and he can't. And he's now realizing that the second set of divers that are coming in the tunnel, they're going to get to this point in the dive, which is very far into the dive, and they won't be able to get past his dead body. And they'll have to turn around, but they don't have enough oxygen, he didn't think, to make it back to the surface. And so almost certainly those three divers are going to get here and be trapped and are going to die too. And so terrified and devastated and saddened by what's ultimately going to happen, he turns and starts heading for the surface. And he had to stop at each of those decompression stops. And you can only imagine what it was like to be sitting inside of this tight tunnel waiting for 30 minutes and 45 minutes, the different decompression stops, just thinking about what's inevitably going to happen beyond the dead body. They're going to get trapped. They're going to die. He's going to be the only one that gets out of here alive. And at some point he makes it up to the surface and he just sits there and waits. Meanwhile, the second set of divers did enter the water 2 hours later. They go down to the tunnel, they're making their way out, and they were farther spread out than the pair was. And so the first diver, the lead diver of the second group, he reached the dead body first before the other two had even seen it or knew about it, and he began to panic. And as the second and third diver come up and realize what's happening, they see the lead diver lose his mouthpiece, and in a panic, he's moving around like this, and he inhales water and also drowns. And so now the second and third diver are dealing with the fact that they just watched their friend die right in front of them. Their other friend from the first group is dead and blocking their way. And the second and third diver, they also begin to panic. They don't communicate, and one of them just immediately turns and starts kicking it out back towards the entrance, knowing full well they probably don't have enough oxygen to get there. The other diver decided they were going to find a way to get past the dead body that was wedged in the only way up to the surface. And so on their own, over 1 kilometer underwater in this tight little tunnel where they're totally trapped, they're relying on a flashlight for light. There's 2 dead bodies. This second diver begins removing pieces of their gear and pushing it through the little space between the dead body and the clearing that he wanted to get to make his way up to the surface. And after pushing through all of his gear, including his tank, which is a big commitment, because once it was through, he would have to go to the other side. He couldn't get it back through, and push himself through painstakingly with his hands all the way through this tiny little space that he could just barely get through. And then he puts his gear back on, and then knowing he had almost no oxygen left, he had to basically rocket to the surface and just hope decompression sickness didn't kill him. The other diver, who had turned around and gone all the way back to the entrance, they skipped all of their decompression stops as well. They got to the entrance just barely, but when they got there, the entrance was frozen over, and they had to punch their way through the ice, which they were able to do, and they too got on surface once again. The 3 survivors linked up, they called authorities, they went to the hospital. They would make a full recovery. They told authorities where their friends were in this cave, but no one had the ability to get down and retrieve their body. So they sealed off both entrances to this cave and called it a gravesite and said no one can go down there. But months later, the 3 survivors had such intense survivor's guilt that they would actually illegally go back to Plur Cave and retrieve their bodies. One night in the early 1950s, a little boy named Issei Sagawa was having this dream where he and his brother were being boiled alive to be eaten. Sagawa says when he woke up, he immediately began fantasizing about what it would be like to be on the other side of that, to be on the outside with a human inside of the pot that you're boiling, that you're going to eat. And he became totally obsessed with the idea of eating another person. By the time he was in first grade, he would find himself staring at his different classmates' legs, and his mouth would be watering because he wanted to take a bite out of their leg. For 3 decades, he was able to suppress that urge, but in 1981, those cannibalistic urges would get the better of him. One summer day while he was in Tokyo, he saw this woman that he wanted to eat, and he couldn't help himself, and so he began following her down the road, and he saw her go into her apartment. He waited for a minute, went around back, and climbed in the window, and when he got inside, she was asleep. And he hadn't thought of a plan for what he was going to do once he was inside, and so he's just standing there thinking, well, now what do I do? How am I going to eat her? What am I going to do next? And as he's sitting there wondering what to do next, she wakes up and she screams and he runs away. After this breaking and entering incident, Sagawa would actually seek help. So he goes to a psychiatrist and he says, this is what I did. I snuck into her house because I wanted to eat her. And the psychiatrist would end up telling Sagawa's family that I have to label him a high risk to society because he's not just thinking about doing these things, he's already acting out these fantasies. Now, Sagawa's father was extremely wealthy and powerful, and when he heard this from the psychiatrist, he was like, no, we're not going to do that. And so using his power and influence, he was able to kind of cover up what the psychiatrist had found, and he shipped his son to Paris. Once Sagawa landed in Paris, he enrolled at the Sorbonne University and began studying literature. Despite having sought help for his cannibalistic urges, when he was in Paris, he started having that urge again and he couldn't control it, and instead of going to another therapist or psychiatrist, he begins to look for another victim. Sagawa considered himself short, weak, and ugly, and so he was actually looking for a tall, beautiful Western woman so he could absorb their energy and somehow become a bigger, better version of himself. And so he began looking around Paris for tall, beautiful women that he could potentially eat, but no one seemed like a good fit until he met Renee Hartevelt. Renee was a tall, beautiful 25-year-old Dutch student who was going to school with Sagawa at Sorbonne. In order to get close to her, Sagawa would ask his father if he would give him some money so he could hire Renee to be his personal tutor. His father gives him the money, Sagawa hires Renee, and they strike up this working relationship together. And over time, Sagawa would build trust with Renee, they would become friends, and at some point he asked Renee if she'll actually come over to his apartment, something they had not done yet. And she's sitting in his apartment with her back turned to him. He leaves the room and comes back with a rifle, and he tries to fire it, but it jams. And she hasn't heard him do this, and so he's standing there and his weapon's now jammed. He hasn't fired it, and he just puts the weapon away and comes back out and acts like nothing's happened. And he's sitting there wondering, is this a sign that I'm not supposed to do this? But at the end of the night, when she finally left, he decides, you know what, I gotta go through with this. I have to eat her. And so the next night he gets her to come over again. He gets the rifle out when she's sitting with her back to him once again, except this time the rifle fires. Only for an instant, he felt really bad and thought, maybe I should call an ambulance. But then he stopped himself and he said, you've waited so long for this. You gotta just go through with it. He immediately tried to take a bite out of her, but it was too difficult and unpalatable. So he calmly leaves his apartment, he goes to the store, he gets a blade, he comes back, and he's able to begin removing pieces of Renee so he can eat them. Over the next 2 days, Sagawa would eat most of Renee, and he would take pictures of himself throughout the entire experience. When he finally felt full, he left a couple pieces still in his freezer, but put the rest of her in a suitcase and went to dump her in a lake. But as he was wheeling these heavy suitcases around town, people saw them, and it just drew a lot of suspicion. And at some point, someone must have called the police. They show up, they ask him what's inside the suitcase, they open it up, and there's Renee. When questioned about it, he just said, I killed her to eat her flesh. Sagawa awaited trial for 2 years in a French prison, and when he finally went in front of a French judge, when the judge read the details of this crime, it seemed so crazy and outrageous that the judge decided there's no way Sagawa can be sane, and so he was deemed insane and unfit to stand trial. He was ordered to go to a mental institution where he would be held indefinitely. Shortly after that, the French deported Sagawa back to Japan, where they expected him to remain in a mental institution for the rest of his life. But that didn't happen because the French dropped his case and his documents were sealed. And when he arrived in Japan, the Japanese could not get access to his court documents, and so they did not have a case against Sagawa, and so they had to let him walk free. And so in 1986, Sagawa checked himself out of the Japanese mental institution that he had been sent to, and he's been free ever since. This is a picture of what police discovered when they opened up Sagawa's fridge inside of his apartment in Paris. This is a picture of his kitchen inside of that apartment, where you can clearly see plates and different utensils that were all used to eat Renee. This is a picture of the suitcase that Sagawa was lugging around that police showed up and asked him to open and found Renee inside of. And this is Sagawa today, walking freely in Tokyo, even though he blatantly killed and ate someone and openly admits to it and has even profited off of it. He's written books and he's been featured on TV shows. He's even been called in to be a food critic. But what's even more horrifying is that Sagawa openly says that before he dies, he's going to do this again. He can't live with himself unless he eats at least one more person. Andrew Macaulay was an adventurer. He started as a rock climber and mountaineer, putting up dozens of big wall routes in Australia, as well as alpine first ascents in New Zealand, Patagonia, and the Himalayas in the 1990s. He took little interest in the marquee peaks. He preferred obscure, lesser-known peaks that were more challenging and complex. But in 1998, he fell nearly 30 meters during a climb and shattered his knee, which made it almost impossible to climb at the level he was climbing at before the injury. This injury that initially seemed like a really big setback because he loved mountain climbing, it ultimately spawned his true life passion that he didn't even know about, and that was sea kayaking. He took to kayaking because it didn't really require the use of his legs, and so he was able to continue to push the limits of his mental and physical endurance, but wasn't hampered by a knee injury. And much like his mountain climbing career, he very quickly began conquering all of the most difficult open ocean kayaking routes all around Australia and New Zealand, to the point where he had done all of them. The only one he had not done was the Tasman Sea. Andrew estimated it would take him approximately 1 month or maybe a little bit longer to cross the 1,000-mile journey. Now, his biggest obstacle was not going to be his own physical or mental endurance. It was going to be the weather, because you're going to be out on the water for at least 30 days. There really isn't a weather window you can shoot for. You can't time this journey so you don't hit a storm. It's more about when you hit the storms, how will your kayak hold up? Other kayakers that had attempted going across the Tasman Sea had used these custom-built kayaks that had these elaborate canopies over the top of them, and they had these self-righting systems where if it flipped, it automatically popped right back up. But Andrew wanted to do it with just a basic kayak. He didn't want all the bells and whistles. He wanted this to be kind of pure. But he did need to create a sort of system to protect himself in the middle of one of these storms. And so he literally went into his backyard and constructed this fiberglass that looked like a trash can that sat over his cockpit on the kayak that he could remove and put on the back of his kayak. And then if he wanted to sleep, he could put it over him, and it was sealed and watertight, and it would protect him from the storm. And if he flipped over, he wouldn't just sink and drown. He called this dome Casper, and he painted a big smiley face on it. And so after months and months of preparing for this journey, finally on January 11th, 2007, Andrew would kiss his wife and his young son goodbye. He would hop in his kayak along with Casper, and he would set sail on his solo journey across the Tasman Sea. For the first 2/3 of the trip, it seemed to be going extremely well. Andrew was checking in regularly on his radio. He had enough food and water. His kayak was holding up. Casper was holding up great at night, so he was able to get some sleep. But some really bad storms that he was anticipating began rolling in kind of all at once in that final third of the journey. During one particularly bad storm, Andrew would remain locked underneath Casper for 28 straight hours as these 30-foot waves would just wreak havoc outside, flipping his kayak over multiple times. I mean, just absolutely terrifying stuff. Inside his kayak, he had this beacon that if he pushed the button, it would send a GPS signal to the rescue crew that would immediately come out and they would save him. And the whole time he's getting thrashed around out in the middle of the ocean, he never presses the button. Because much like he he didn't want to have all the bells and whistles on his kayak, he also didn't want any help. So instead, he would send kind of sarcastic text messages to the people on shore, making light of the situation he was in. Like during this storm, he sent a text message that just said, "No picnic today." 12 days after that particular storm, where he was locked inside for 28 hours, he had made it to within 80 miles of the finish line. And so he texts his wife and just says, "See you Sunday at 9 a.m. This was on a Thursday. And so when his wife, Vicky, gets this text message, she's so excited. She gets together everybody that wants to meet him at the finish line. And in fact, they all go there early on Thursday to just hang out and camp out until he arrives. But 24 hours after that text message was sent to his wife, Andrew would send a distress signal to the New Zealand Coast Guard. On the recording, Andrew sounds desperate. He also sounds deeply fatigued, or maybe even hypothermic, and he's pleading with them to come rescue him because his kayak is sinking. At first, people, including the Coast Guard, thought this could be a hoax, because Andrew was so competent out on the water, and he had just gotten in touch with his wife the day earlier saying, "Everything's great, I'm almost done, I've made it past all the hard stuff, I'll see you on Sunday." But of course, they still send out a search crew that night to look for Andrew. They can't find him, so the next day, on Saturday, they expand their search and they do find Andrew's kayak, except Andrew's not in it. The only thing missing was the canopy to the kayak. The rest of the kayak seemed to work just fine. His distress beacon had not been pressed, his GPS was still there, and his camera was still there. No one knows what happened to Andrew in his final hours before he ultimately disappeared. The prevailing theory is he must have been capsized and separated from his kayak, and then was unable to either get back to it or even climb back in because he was so tired. This is the final picture that was taken on Andrew's camera, and you can tell from his expression that he's not particularly happy to be in the situation he's in. And in fact, in some of the earlier video clips he shot, he actually says to the camera that he feels like he bit off more than he could chew, and that he wishes he could just be home with his wife and his son. Despite extensive search efforts, Andrew was never found. At 7:27 p.m. on February 9th, 2004, a woman called the Grafton County Sheriff's Department to report a car accident. A small black sedan appeared to be wedged up against a snowbank off the side of the highway near this woman's house in Woodsville, New Hampshire. The sheriff thanked her for calling and dispatched officers to check it out. 16 minutes later, at 7:43 p.m., the sheriff's department gets another call about this black sedan up against the snowbank, and it came in from a local school bus driver. The driver said he was going down the road and he sees this black sedan up against the side of the road, and what appeared to be the driver, this young woman, no one was helping her. So the school bus driver pulls over and walks up to her. She says her name is Mora Murray. She's 21 years old. She's a college student in Massachusetts. She seemed totally fine, but was adamant that he did not call the police. And so the school bus driver at the time didn't call the police. He kind of sized her up as seeming like she was okay. She said she was going to call for a tow truck. And so he left thinking she was going to be just fine. But only a couple of minutes after leaving the scene, he felt like, you know what, I got to call the police because something just seemed off. The sheriff tells him that they had already gotten a call about 20 minutes earlier and that officers would be there any minute, and I'm sure she's just fine. 3 minutes later, the officer who was originally dispatched to check out this black sedan shows up and radios in and says, the black sedan is here, but there's no girl, there's no driver. Police do an initial search of the area. They can't find Mora. There's no sign of where she would have gone. There's no sign of a struggle. They get in touch with Mora's family. They can't get in touch with Mora. And so it's like she just kind of vanished. And so that night, they labeled Mora officially a missing person. On February 8th, the day before Mora went missing, she was with her father. They went out to eat, and he would say to police that she seemed totally normal. There was no red flags. There was no clear stressors in her life. Everything just seemed normal. The next morning when she gets up on February 9th, this is the day she goes missing, she finds out that all of her classes that day have been canceled because of a snowstorm. She gets up, goes over to her computer, and emails all of her professors as well as her work supervisor and tells them that there's been a death in her family and she needs to take the next week off. Family members would say that there was no death in the family, that was a lie. After emailing her professors, she drives to an ATM, withdraws $280, and then goes to a liquor store and buys $40 worth of alcohol. She also stopped at the Amherst DMV to get some paperwork she needed for some damage that had been done to her car. After that, we don't really know what she was doing until she wound up on that snowbank in Woodsville, New Hampshire. When police searched her abandoned car, they found printed out directions to a condo complex in Burlington, Vermont. Cell phone records show Mora had placed a call to one of the owners of a condo that had been put up for rent, but Mora had not indicated to anyone in her life that she was looking to rent a condo in Burlington, Vermont. Nor had she indicated to anyone that she might be traveling to Vermont for any reason. When they searched her dorm room, all of her belongings had been packed and her room had been meticulously cleaned. It was clear that she was getting ready to leave her dorm, but this is mid-semester. There's no reason she'd be leaving prematurely. And on top of her belongings in her dorm room was this typed up note to her boyfriend detailing all of their relationship issues. It wasn't a breakup note, but it was definitely something close to that. Most of Mora's belongings were either in her dorm room, all packed up, or in her abandoned car. But her cell phone, debit cards, and credit cards were all missing. However, they were never used again after the day she went missing, February 9th. 6 days after Mora went missing, a massive search is conducted around her abandoned car. They covered 20 square miles. They had helicopters. They had sent sniffing dogs. They had hundreds of people on the ground, and there was just no trace of her. But even more strangely, on the night Mora went missing, there was snow on the ground. So you'd think you'd be able to find a couple footprints showing you where Mora might have gone. But there was none, and the scent-sniffing dogs could only track her scent about 100 feet away from the car before they lost the scent. It was like she vanished into thin air. So something happened to Mora Murray between 7:46 p.m. when the bus driver left the scene and called the police. He said she was there, he saw her, and 7:49 p.m. when the officer who was dispatched arrived on scene and Mora's not there. She went somewhere, we just don't know where or why or with who. And unfortunately, to this day, this case remains unsolved. Here is the final picture of Mora Murray. This is her withdrawing $280 at that ATM shortly before she hopped back in her car, drove up to Woodsville, New Hampshire, crashed on the side of the road, and then disappeared. On October 31st, 2013, 4 mechanics were performing routine maintenance on a wind turbine in the Netherlands. In the early afternoon, all 4 of them are standing on top of the turbine itself, 2 on one end and 2 on the other, and a small fire breaks out inside of the housing of the turbine, right near where you would go back into the housing. Now, it's unclear what caused the fire, but it's speculated that it was caused by a short circuit. The 2 engineers on this side of the turbine were able to jump over the fire, land in the stairwell, and run their way down to safety. The other 2 on this side had a bad angle and could not make the jump, and so they had to wait until rescue workers showed up to put the fire out. But wind turbines are usually in areas that are very far away from society because they're huge and they're kind of eyesores. And so the response time was not good. The fire department did not show up very quickly, and by the time they got to the wind turbine, that little fire had gotten much, much bigger and had creeped up onto the platform that they are on. And then when the fire department actually started performing their job, the fire had spread well down the stairwell, and so it was very difficult and took a very long time to make their way up using the stairs. And the crane on the truck itself did not extend high enough to reach them either. The 2 trapped mechanics are watching this in real time. They're looking down and they can see the fire department is not going to be able to reach us in time because the fire is now spreading and getting bigger and bigger, and they're being pushed to the very edge of this wind turbine with an 80-meter fall to the ground. As the fire inched closer and closer and closer to them, the men must have realized that they have to make a decision here. They can either sit here and wait and hope for some miracle that perhaps a helicopter shows up and scoops them up, or some other mechanism of rescue is able to occur, or they try to make a run for it through the flames on the top of the turbine into the stairwell and just hope that the fire in the stairwell is not as severe and that maybe they can run through it and make it out the other side. Or the final option is to jump off the side and hope you survive the fall. And so as the fire continued to grow and get closer and closer to them, the men embrace one last time, and then one of them makes a run for it through the flames into the stairwell. His charred body would be found right at the landing of the stairs. He did not make it very far. He really had no hope. The last remaining mechanic is standing there wondering what he should do. He's probably looking down in hopes that he's going to see his friend who just ran in there emerge at the bottom on the ground, safe. But he doesn't. And after a considerable amount of time and the fire is getting closer and closer, he knows his friend didn't make it, and probably not wanting to suffer the fate that his friend did, he jumps. This is the picture of the 2 mechanics embracing for that final time. I'm sure at the time of this picture, they were aware that almost certainly they were not going to get out of this alive. They were 19 and 21 years old. On July 17, 2014, people at Amsterdam's bustling international airport began boarding Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 that was bound for Kuala Lumpur. The 283 passengers on board were from all over the world. Some were traveling for vacation, some were going home, others were just traveling for business. In addition to the 283 passengers, there were also 15 crew members that rounded out the flight to a total of 298 people on board MH17. One of the passengers, before walking down the runway to get on the flight, took a picture of the plane itself and uploaded it to Facebook and kind of jokingly captioned it, "If we go missing, this is what it looks like," in reference to another Malaysian Airlines flight, Flight 370, that had actually gone missing just a couple of months earlier. Once the boarding was complete on MH17, one of the passengers on board uploaded to Instagram a short video of passengers stuffing their luggage into bins and the captain coming over the intercom saying that, boarding is complete and it's time to turn off your cell phones as we prepare for takeoff. A 15-year-old Dutch boy named Gary Slock and his mother Petra had just sat down inside the plane and they could barely contain their excitement. The pair had signed up for what they were calling a vacation of a lifetime with a group that took single parents and their children on these lavish vacations. Gary, who was the goalkeeper for a soccer team, had been telling his family how jealous his teammates were of this trip he was about to go on with his mother. Before Gary turned off his phone, as instructed by the captain, he took a selfie of he and his mom grinning ear to ear, excited about their trip, and he uploaded it to Facebook for his friends and family to see. Gary turns off his cell phone, puts it away, and he and his mom sit back and get ready for takeoff. The plane takes off without a hitch. It gets up to cruising altitude, and it's going to be a long flight. It's about 12 hours from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur, and so everybody on board is kind of settling in. They're getting their iPads out. They're getting a book out maybe. The crew is making their rounds, offering snacks and drinks, and people are looking out the window. It's a beautiful day, and everyone's just kind of settling in for a long flight. About 3 hours after takeoff, around 4 p.m., the captain of MH17 got in touch with air traffic control at the nearby airport, which was in Ukraine. The pilot told controllers that everything was fine. He was flight level, 33,000 feet. The controllers acknowledged that and said, "Hey, there's a little bit of air traffic in the direction you're going. You need to reroute your course very slightly." The pilot acknowledged this change in course and was beginning to tell them what he was going to do next when he cut out. The controllers on the ground in Ukraine began hailing MH17 to try to get the captain back online. They couldn't reach him. The plane had sent no distress signals, and over the course of their communication, the controllers had not noticed anything abnormal. And so this sudden radio silence really didn't make any sense. Yelena Brichenko was a 20-year-old bank teller living in Ukraine who happened to be looking up right as MH17 was flying overhead. She would later say that what she saw would haunt her for the rest of her life. As she was watching, MH17 just explodes, and the people inside of the plane very clearly get ejected out of the plane. And she's watching as these people and bits of plane are falling from 33,000 feet, and they come crashing down in this huge fiery inferno. The theory, backed by US intelligence, was that pro-Russian separatists could have fired a missile at this plane thinking it was Ukrainian military. It was not. It was just civilians. All 298 people on board MH17 perished, including Gary and Petra. This is the selfie that Gary took moments before takeoff with his mother as they were excited about their vacation. Family and friends that saw this picture on Facebook would say that this image perfectly captures Gary's wonderful personality and the love that Gary and Petra had. In 2014, the United States Navy decided it was time to decommission one of their old frigate ships, and so they sent it to a dock to be broken down for scrap. In order for workers to actually be able to access the underside of the ship and actually begin to break it down, they would need to dry dock the ship, which meant the ship would basically drive into this special locking corral where the doors would shut behind it, the water would drain out from underneath, and the ship would be left resting on these huge wooden blocks that elevated it off the ground. And with no water in there, workers were able to get underneath the hull and could access every part of the ship without obstruction. It's important to note for this story that when a ship is in dry dock, there is only one way on or off. It's this ramp called a gangway that leads from the dock onto the deck of the ship. Besides that, there is nowhere else for you to get on this ship. And if for some reason you really wanted to get on and couldn't use the gangway, you could in theory try to run and leap from the dock to the ship. There's a pretty significant gap there all the way around, but you could try the jump. But if you weren't successful at grabbing onto the ship, you would fall multiple stories, probably to your death, because there's no water in the dry dock. So this old frigate ship that was being decommissioned was officially dry docked in July of 2014. The first group of people that went on board the ship to begin dismantling it were military personnel. They were in charge of removing all of the sensitive equipment before civilians were allowed to go on board. The military personnel begin to wrap up, and it's getting late in the day, and they tell the foreman, who's in charge of all of the civilian workers that are going to be going on and finishing this decommissioning of this ship. They go to the foreman and they say, hey, we're done, we're wrapped up for the night, your workers are good to go, they can get on here tomorrow. The foreman would send a message to his boss that night, letting him know that they were on track to start work the next day. The boss would respond and say, hey, can you go on there tonight and take pictures of all the different workstations so we know how many people that we need to place in different segments of this big ship. So the foreman walks onto the ship and proceeds to take hundreds of pictures all over the inside of the ship. Now, the ship itself was pitch black inside. There was no electricity and it was nighttime. So he had a flashlight the whole time, but whenever he took a picture, he would turn his flashlight off and then use the flash on his camera before going back to his actual flashlight. So all night he's going room to room taking all these pictures, and at some point he realizes he's photographed everything he needs to. So he leaves, he goes back to his office, he uploads the pictures, and he sends them to his boss. His boss wrote back almost immediately and just said, "Who's the guy with the axe?" Now, the foreman has no idea what he's talking about. He was just in the ship by himself for a couple of hours and didn't see anyone. So he reads the email again to make sure he read it correctly, and he sees that his boss has actually attached the picture he is referring to. Here is this guy clearly clutching an axe in a hallway that he was just in. And even creepier is the foreman is looking at where this picture was taken, and it was relatively early on in his photo shoot. And he had walked past the exact area where this guy is poking his head out of, which means the whole time he was down there, this guy with an axe was there with him. They review the security footage of a camera that was aimed directly at the ramp, the one entrance in and out of this ship. And from the time the foreman left, no one else left. So they don't know how he got on or how he got off without being detected, but somehow he did. In 2014, Alan Ruby was a 19-year-old freshman studying political science at the University of Oklahoma. Despite being relatively modest and soft-spoken in person, on social media, he projected this lifestyle of wealth and grandeur. He'd oftentimes post pictures of exotic sports cars and expensive watches and clothes, and he would travel the world to Paris, London, New York City, and take all these pictures showing off this incredible life he had. He really wanted people to believe that he was this fabulously wealthy, successful guy. Alan was only able to project this phony lifestyle on social media because he was spending his father's money. His father was a successful businessman who was also the publisher of a newspaper that was quite successful, and so Alan would just spend his money, and then even after his father would give him money, Alan would steal his credit card and additionally rack up thousands of dollars of credit card debt. But as media began to shift away from print media to almost all digital, a lot of newspapers began to fail because they weren't able to transition to digital. And his father's newspaper was not making that transition very well, and they were losing money left and right. And so Alan's father told everybody in his family, with a focus on Alan, that we all need to cut back on our spending because money's tight right now and it's unclear if it's going to turn around. So we got to be careful with how much money we do have. Alan acted like he was going to cut back on his lavish lifestyle, but in reality, he wasn't going to. He was totally addicted to spending money and giving off this vibe that he was so wealthy and successful. And so around this time, Alan steals his grandmother's credit card and secretly leaves the country and goes to Paris to have this vacation on his own. He's taking these pictures in front of the Eiffel Tower and he's spending all this money. And his father finds out that he's stolen this credit card and he's furious. And instead of waiting for Alan to come home and saying, don't do that again, he decides he's going to send him a message that he's going to remember. And he calls the police. Alan gets charged with theft. He pleads guilty and he has to go before a judge who sees that he has no criminal record. So he kind of goes easy on him. And he says that you need to pay back all the money you spent to your grandmother. and you need to go to an addiction program to try to break this habit of yours, to stop spending all this money. After Alan leaves court, his father felt like he finally got the message. It seemed like it had finally gotten through to him that this was a really big problem, and he felt like he had made the right decision in calling the police. But in reality, Alan hadn't changed at all. As soon as he got back from court, he was stealing from people outside of the family, he was taking loans from loan sharks, all of this just to keep up with his phony appearance he portrayed on social media. On October 9th, 2014, Alan owed $3,000 to a particular loan shark and had no way of paying it back. So instead of asking his parents for money, which for him would have been too embarrassing, he decides the best course of action is to kill his entire family. And so he strolls into his home and he shoots his mom dead, he shoots his sister dead, and then he waits for his dad to come home and he shoots him dead. Because his big plan is, with his whole family gone, he's going to become the sole heir to the family's estate, and that will be enough money to not only pay off this $3,000 debt, but have a little left over so he can go on vacation to Paris again. So after he's committed this horrible crime, he leaves his family where they are, he goes and takes the surveillance footage from inside the house, it was on a DVD, takes the DVD out, takes the murder weapon, leaves the house, chucks the DVD and the weapon into a lake, and proceeds to drive to Dallas, where he checks into a very fancy hotel and meets up with friends and parties the whole weekend. His friends that were with him that weekend would later tell investigators that Alan seemed totally normal. There was no red flags, there was no indication that anything was wrong. He was just laughing it up and having a great time that whole weekend. The following Monday, when Alan's father doesn't show up for work, the police are notified. They go to the house and they find the Ruby family. When police went out and got Alan and brought him back to the station to chat with him and tell him what happened and see if he knew anything, his sad reaction to his whole family now being deceased was apparently so insincere that officers almost immediately assumed that he was probably the guy that did it. Ultimately, Alan would confess, and the prosecutor wanted to push for the death penalty, but Alan's remaining living family members actually said, "Don't do the death penalty. We don't want to risk that not happening. We want to see justice served right now. Can we create a plea agreement where he gets life in jail, but there's absolutely no way for him to get paroled, no matter how good his behavior is, no matter how old he is, no matter what, he can't ever get out of jail." And so they did. They created that plea agreement. They gave it to Alan to sign. He signs it, and as they're walking out of the courtroom, his last remaining family members disown him and say, "May God have mercy on your soul," and they leave. This is the picture that Alan uploaded to his Instagram account just hours after killing his entire family. They're all lying on the ground in his house at the time this picture is being taken. He's in this fancy hotel room with his friends, and the caption reads, "College wouldn't be half as fun without these two peaches. #BestFriends." In 2011, Heike Dorsch and her boyfriend Stefan Rahman were living their best life sailing southwest from the Galapagos Islands. For the last 3 years, they had abandoned their lives in the city and had moved on to Stefan's catamaran and were just sailing the globe. On August 30th, 2011, after a particular stretch where they had been at sea for 17 days consecutively without seeing land anywhere, Heike was laying down on the catamaran catching some sun when she heard Stefan yell out, "Land!" And she looked up and she saw these mountainous islands kind of coming into view just over the horizon. These were the 15 islands that make up the Marquesas Island range within French Polynesia. Heike remembers not being able to control her grin. It was like she couldn't stop smiling because it really looked like paradise, and she was so excited to land there. The Marquesas Island range were not big tourist attractions because of how mountainous and rocky they were, and the water was not that beautiful Kool-Aid blue that people expect out of French Polynesia. But for Heike and Stefan, this was perfect. They were not looking for mass market tourism, they were looking for authentic cultural contact. And it would turn out that the Marquesas Island range was perfect for this because the locals just weren't used to seeing tourists. And so before long, the locals were embracing Heike and Stefan and bringing them down to the beach for their cookouts and going spearfishing with them. And even one night they were invited into a local's home where they got to be a part of a big family dinner. After 6 weeks, Heike and Stefan had explored the majority of the Marquesas Island range, but there was still one of the 15 islands that they had not yet explored called Nuku Hiva. And so on the day before they planned to leave the island range, they decided to go check it out. When they dropped anchor in the bay that sat just outside of this island, there were no boats, there were no fishermen, there were no people, there was nothing. It was like a deserted island. And so they make their way on the beach and they see there's this trail that goes inland. Being explorers, they couldn't help themselves but walk down the trail to see what's down there. After 15 minutes of walking down this jungle path, they come to a clearing, and in this clearing is this very strange looking village that's made up of all these shacks. They can't tell if people live there or have lived there recently, because to them, it just looks totally abandoned. And as they're kind of looking around, they notice way down the path beyond these shacks is one man standing in the middle of the road. He's this really big guy with his shirt off, standing next to a horse, and he's just looking directly at them. He's not waving to them, he's not signaling to them, he's just watching them. And it kind of creeped them out at first, but they decided that the polite thing to do would be to go over and talk to him, because this is probably his village and they were the trespassers. So they go over to this guy and they introduce themselves, and he says that his name is Arihano and that he lives in this village. Through broken French, they're able to have a semi-normal conversation, which seemed like pleasantries. And at some point, Stefan, just off the cuff, asked this guy if he'd be willing to be his guide on a hunt. He wanted to go hunting for goats, which is something that everybody did on the Marquesas Island, and Stefan really wanted to be a part of that. And Arihano says, sure, I'll be your guide. Heike was a little bit caught off guard, but wasn't surprised, because Stefan had been talking endlessly about how he wanted to go on a goat hunt before they left the Marquesas Island range. But she didn't feel like doing this, so she said, you two go, I'll meet you over at the boat. So Heike turns around and starts walking down the jungle path back towards their boat, and she turns around one more time and she sees Stefan and Arihano walking into the jungle down another path, and they disappear. Heike spent the next several hours just laying out on the beach, waiting for Stefan to return. But after quite a while, and she hadn't heard anything, she started to get a little bit worried. And as she's starting to get worried, she hears someone yelling out on the water. And from around the corner, Arihano comes around on his boat, and he's waving to her, and he's yelling for her in French that there's been an accident, that Stefan's been hurt, and she needs to come with him. Without another thought, Heike runs into the water, jumps into Arihano's dinghy, and the two of them drive back around the corner to wherever Arihano and Stefan had been. They land at this little tiny beach that's right up against a jungle, and immediately Heike jumps out, runs right into the jungle, and she's yelling for Stefan, and there's no sign of him. He's not yelling back. She has no idea where to look, and she kept turning around and asking Arihano, where is he? What happened to him? And Arihano just wasn't really giving her a good answer. He was just being quiet. Frustrated, Heike walks even farther into the jungle. She's yelling even louder, and still there's nothing. And so she turns around to confront Arihano and be like, where is Stefan? What's going on? And as soon as she does, she's met with a gun right in her face. Heike immediately grabbed the barrel and tried to fight it away from him, and she could tell that he tried to fire the gun, but the safety was on, and so nothing fired. They kind of struggled with the gun, and at some point he got on top of her and just restrained her and tied her up to a tree. And then he just walked away into the jungle without saying anything. And so Heike is expecting at any moment for him to return and kill her. And she even said that she wished he had just shot her then and there, because the anxiety of waiting for whatever was going to happen was way worse. While Arihano was gone, Heike struggled to try to get the ropes off of her and the rope around her neck off of her, but she couldn't do it. And as she's sitting there struggling, Arihano would return and he would beat her up a little bit before ultimately turning around and leaving once again. Arihano would come back a couple hours later after it had gotten dark, and she's still there struggling to get these ropes off of her, and he would hit her a couple times before leaving again. But when he hit her, he actually managed to loosen some of her restraints, and as soon as he did walk off into the jungle that second time, she was able to get the restraints off of her wrist and her neck. Now, she had no idea where Arihano was, but as soon as she took one step, she saw a flashlight maybe a couple hundred meters away flip towards her, and she knew it was Arihano. He had heard her move. And so Heike just starts running full speed. She's stepping on thorns. She's getting slashed by all the undergrowth. She doesn't care. She is running for her life. And because it was a full moon, she could actually see the water because the beach was right next to where she was being held. And so she just ran for the water. And when she got onto the beach, she could see there was another boat out in the water near where theirs had been anchored. And when she looks at the beach, she can see that Arihano must have turned around, because she can see a flashlight kind of bobbing its way farther and farther deeper into the jungle. Using the couple's satellite phone, Heike was able to alert authorities, who launched a search for Stefan. And initially they couldn't find him, and they couldn't find Arihano. But 3 days into the search, they made a grisly discovery. The Marquesan Islands are actually known for the Marquesan warriors that used to inhabit these islands up until the 12th century. And they were known for being the most aggressive cannibals in the South Pacific. In particular, the island of Nuku Hiva, which is where Stefan had just gone missing, and where Heike had just been attacked by Arihano. But historians believe nobody on Marquesas has practiced cannibalism since the 12th century. That practice has gone away. Well, until 2011, when Arihano, who was in fact a Marquesas warrior, met Stefan and decided that now is a good time to bring that practice back. Right after Heike had turned around and walked back to the beach and Stefan and Arihano had gone on their hunt, Arihano had attacked Stefan, tied him up, and described seeing his neck pulsing with fear as Arihano built this massive campfire that authorities said was 3 times bigger than any campfire they'd ever come across. And then Arihano shot him and put him in the fire. Although Arihano would be captured and convicted of killing Stefan, Arihano would never actually come out and say that he had in fact eaten portions of Stefan, and it was impossible to tell from his remains how much had been consumed versus burned off in the fire. But virtually anybody who was involved in this case has their suspicions that Arihano had ritualistically cannibalized Stefan. In 2005, Addie Hall met Zach Bowen when they were both bartending in New Orleans. Addie liked to give Zach a really hard time and kind of played the mean girl as her way of flirting with him, but really what she was doing is testing Zach to see if he could put up with her because she had a mean streak. She would have these crazy, angry outbursts and would yell and scream at people around her, and then she'd turn it off just like that, and she needed to make sure that he could put up with her. Zach, it would turn out, had his own mean streak and his own angry outbursts, and so in many ways they were very similar. Many of Zach and Addie's friends that were around them in those first few weeks they were together did not think this relationship would last very long because of how often they fought with each other. But it just so happened that Zach and Addie had met one another just weeks before Hurricane Katrina came through New Orleans and just devastated the area. And so before it arrived, Zach and Addie decide, let's stick it out. Let's stay here together. Let's ride this storm out together. And it was actually that storm that brought them together, and they both fell madly in love with each other and became totally inseparable. After the storm cleared, Zach and Addie went out into the streets and began cooking food for people, and they had all this alcohol in their apartment, and they set up a makeshift bar outside in the French Quarter and were just giving away drinks to these people whose lives have been devastated by this storm. Their tale of love and colorful survivalism attracted many media outlets, including the New York Times, who did a feature on them. For a time, Zach and Addie felt like the king and queen of the French Quarter, and they were so happy. But when reality set back in and the real cleanup ensued and electricity was restored and people started moving back into their homes and people started going to work again, Zach and Addie were forced back into their old lifestyle, something neither of them wanted to experience again. So for the next year, Zach and Addie struggled to make ends meet. Their bills continued to pile up, and really those two were at each other's throats all the time with these horrible, vicious fights. In October of 2006, when it seems like Zach and Addie's relationship is really on the rocks, they decide in order to reinvigorate their relationship, they're going to move out of their current apartment where there's lots of bad memories, and they're going to move into a new one. They found a little apartment over the famed Voodoo Temple on Rampart Street, and they immediately made a cash offer and they moved in. No sooner had they moved in did Addie go down to the landlord and say, remove Zach from the lease. She had found out that he was cheating on her, and she was preparing to kick him out of her life. Zach found out that he was not on the lease before Addie could confront him about it, and it turned into this wicked fight between the two of them. A couple of days later, Zach showed up for work at the bar, and some of his coworkers recalled that he was acting really funny. He was wearing a hat pulled down low over his head and sunglasses and was really quiet, and when anybody asked him, like, what's going on with you? Why are you acting so strange? He would just tell them he was fine and would quickly walk away from them. Around the same time, Addie stopped showing up for work at all, and her coworkers turned to Zach and said, where's Addie? And he would say that they got into this fight and that Addie had actually left New Orleans and gone back to her hometown in North Carolina. And some people thought that was a little bit fishy because Addie loved New Orleans, but anybody that knew Addie knew she was very unpredictable, and if they had had this huge blowout fight, it is possible that she could have left for North Carolina. A week later, on October 17th, 2006, the New Orleans police receive a phone call from a hotel in the area that spotted what they think is a body laying on the roof of their parking garage. When the police arrived, they could tell it was a deceased man and that he had died from impact, but they couldn't tell if it was a murder, a suicide, or a tragic accident. So they began searching his body to see if there was any indication of what happened, and they pull out a note that's addressed to police in his back pocket. The note is fairly long, but he communicates to the police that this was not an accident. I had to take my own life because I took a life, and if you go to my apartment on Rampart Street, you'll find the body of my girlfriend, Addie Hall, who I killed. Police rush to the address that was given in the note. They're horrified at what they find inside. As soon as they stepped into the apartment, the temperature dropped. The air conditioning had been set to the lowest it could possibly be, so it's very cold in the apartment. And they look around and they see these strange messages spray painted all over the walls. Things like, "I'm a total failure," and "Look in the oven." And there are arrows pointing on the walls towards the kitchen and towards the oven itself that's sitting in the kitchen. And sure enough, when they open up the oven, they find Addie. Police also found Addie's journal, and inside of it, Zach had left an 8-page, very detailed confession of how he had strangled Addie and then had tried to cook her to make it easier to dispose of her body, but couldn't finish the job, and that's when he went to the hotel and threw himself off. Here are some crime scene photos from outside the apartment as well as inside. You can see some of the messages that Zach had spray painted to the wall indicating to go check the oven. And here is the infamous oven where Addie's remains were found, as well as a message left in the kitchen saying that he was sorry he couldn't finish in reference to his inability to finish cooking her and disposing of her body. Crazy as it sounds, this apartment is still being rented out today, and it includes this exact stove. Soon after the Beatles dissolved in 1969, one of the 4 members, John Lennon, left his native England and moved to New York City. Lennon and his wife Yoko Ono took up residence in the Dakota, which is a very famous building that typically houses the rich and famous people of New York. As soon as Lennon moved to New York, he said that he felt relieved because he didn't have to worry about going outside and getting mobbed by a massive crowd of people that were obsessed with the Beatles. There were people that were huge Beatles fans in New York, but they seemed more respectful, and they would ask for his autograph, but they would mostly leave him alone. Mark David Chapman had always been a massive fan of the Beatles with a particular interest in John Lennon. But after a 1966 interview where John Lennon kind of off the cuff said that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus, this soured Chapman's adoration of Lennon. One of Chapman's high school friends recalls around this time frame Chapman rewriting the song Imagine by John Lennon to read, "Imagine if John Lennon was dead." Chapman started referring to Lennon as a poser and said that he espoused virtues and ideals that he himself did not practice. And so in relative short order, following that 1966 interview, Chapman went from this adoring fan of the Beatles and John Lennon to really solely hating John Lennon and everything he stood for. By 1980, it's safe to say Mark Chapman had become obsessed with John Lennon. Specifically, he had become obsessed with hating John Lennon. In October of 1980, Chapman quits his job as a security guard and flies to New York City. For 2 months, he stayed in the city and didn't really do much of anything. He would just periodically walk past the Dakota where John Lennon supposedly was living, but beyond that, he really didn't do anything in the city. But that would all change on December 8th, 1980. On that day, Chapman went to the Dakota, and he stood right outside the entrance to this building and just waited in hopes that he might run into John Lennon. At 5 p.m. that day, John Lennon comes out with his wife Yoko Ono, and they walk right past Mark Chapman, who flags them down, and he asks John if he can have his autograph. And John Lennon, even though he has a limousine waiting for him, and there's people that are starting to notice that, oh, that's John Lennon, people are coming over, John still took the time to sign an autograph for Mark Chapman. He was very friendly with Mark and asked him if this is enough. Do you want anything else? And Mark said, no, that's it. That's fine. And John Lennon said, okay, take care. And John and his wife Yoko Ono turned and went into the limousine and they drove away. When the couple got back to the Dakota that night, Mark Chapman had not left. John Lennon and Yoko Ono get out of their vehicle and they walk past Mark Chapman, who's standing right outside the front door. It's unclear if Mark and John had any interaction, but as soon as they passed Mark and were making their way into the building, Mark Chapman drew a gun and shot John Lennon 4 times in the back. And John Lennon staggers into the lobby screaming, I'm shot, before collapsing and dying. And Mark Chapman, he knew what he was doing. He just stood there, put the gun back in his pocket, and just waited to be arrested. Chapman's lawyers wanted him to plead insanity, but he refused and instead said, I was totally sane, I knew what I was doing, I chose to shoot John Lennon, and I plead guilty. And he was given 20 years to life in jail. And while he was in jail, he would admit that the only reason he did that was to become famous. That was it. This is the picture of Mark Chapman getting that autograph from John Lennon in front of the Dakota just hours before he would gun him down. He's still in jail today, and he actually just had his 11th parole hearing last month in August of 2020, and it was denied. A disaster began to quietly unfold at 8:49 a.m. on April 16, 2014. The Sewol Ferry that was on a routine trip to Jeju Island in South Korea was beginning to lean very badly to one side. The ferry had recently undergone illegal renovations, adding a whole bunch of new rooms to the top of the ferry that made it much more profitable, but dangerously top-heavy. Corrupt regulators who were bought off with fancy dinners and travel allowed the ship to sail unsafe despite never having stepped foot on board. Had they gone on the ship themselves, they would have seen immediately how unsafe it was. On April 16th, the day this ferry is making its way to Jeju Island and is now leaning to one side, ferry workers had loaded twice the legal limit onto the ferry and then hadn't properly secured really any of it. So there were cars and shipping containers that were not tethered. So as the badly balanced Sewol Ferry is making its way out to Jeju Island, it hits some very strong currents and makes a sharp turn to avoid them, causing the ship to begin to keel over. As soon as it begins to keel over, all those unsecured cars and containers all shift all at once to one side of the ship, causing it to completely roll over on its side and begin sinking. On board were 476 passengers, of which 325 were high school students on a school trip. As soon as the ship comes to rest on its side, the captain comes over the intercom and tells everybody to stay in your rooms and await further instruction. And everybody listens. They all stay in their room. And honestly, you can't blame them because they're on a routine ferry trip that happens dozens of times a day without any incident. And the captain of the ship is telling you everything's fine. You just stay where you are. We'll tell you what to do next. After a little while, a lot of the students start to feel a little bit anxious because there's been no further instruction. They're still sideways and they're starting to realize that if they needed to, it would be hard to get out of the ship. A lot of them were way into the bowels of the ship and they would literally need to climb up and out of the ship to safety. A student actually called the authorities and said, "Hey, I think the ship I'm on is sinking." And the authorities hadn't heard of it because the captain and the crew of the ship were just totally crippled and could not make a decision and had wasted all this time that they could have been evacuating people and getting help, and instead were just panicked and frozen in terror. There would be over 20 calls from students pleading with authorities to come save them because now they know the ship is sinking because they can hear the sound of water rushing into the ship, and it's just a matter of time before it reaches them. Finally, almost an hour after the ship had originally keeled over onto its side, the captain issues the evacuation call to the whole ship. But at this point, water's already getting into the compartments where these students have been told to stay, and students aren't able to leave, and there's this panic to get out of the ship. So the evacuation order was doing nothing. It was already too late. One person who survived, who had left early and disobeyed the stay in your room order, they had climbed to the top of the ship, which was really the side of the ship, and they were looking down into the ship through a hallway. And they said there was this mass of people that were coming out of their rooms and trying to climb up this hallway right as a rush of water poured in through the side of this hallway and completely filled it, and they were gone. Later on, when divers would go down to recover the bodies, they would find that many of the students had broken fingers from desperately trying to climb up those hallways when water was pouring in on them. After the divers recovered the bodies, investigators began going through their cell phones to get some sense of what happened. And on their phones were these tragic pictures and videos of these students staying in their rooms like they were told to do, just waiting for their captain to give them further instruction that never came. The captain actually abandoned ship right after that 9:30 call to evacuate came when hundreds of students were still down below. He left the ship. So they were totally on their own, just waiting for help that never came. Of the 476 passengers, 304 would perish, and many believe that almost all of them could have been saved had they just evacuated as soon as the ship keeled over. And so as a result of his gross negligence, the captain was given a life sentence. In the 1930s, notorious dictator Joseph Stalin began deporting people that he viewed as threats to the regime. Now, at first, that was just political opponents, and he rounded up thousands of those. But over time, Stalin just started rounding up anybody he didn't like. And so as more and more people were deported, Stalin needed a place to put them. The option he settled on was sending these people to Siberia because it was thousands of miles away from civilization. And the way he saw it is they wouldn't be a threat to the regime anymore because they'd be too busy just trying to survive. Eventually, millions of people were deported to Siberia to fend for themselves, and many people died in the process. But the worst fate of anybody deported to Siberia has to be the roughly 7,000 people that that were sent to Nazino Island off the western side of Siberia. In May of 1933, the first 5,000 deportees that would be sent to Nazino Island arrived on its shores. Now, they had been packed inside of barges. Many of them were weak or sick, and so disease quickly spread. And just by the time they arrived, 27 people had already died just in transit. As the survivors disembark onto this snowy island, they see immediately that there's nothing on it. It's this tiny little island. There's no shelter. There's no food. There's no tools. There's no way to make shelter. They're just totally stranded. Their Soviet guards had promised them a ration of flour, but for the first 4 days, they refused to give it to them, and another 295 people died. And to make matters worse, after a couple of days, another almost 2,000 people were shipped out to this island. And so by the time the guards actually took their boats into shore to give the flour to these people, they were starving to death, and they rushed the boats to try to steal the flour, and the guards began shooting at them, took the flour, and went back out to the water. The next day, they came back in to try to give them the flour, and the same thing happened. And so they went back out to the water, and they orchestrated this plan where for every 150 prisoners, there would be a brigadier. And that brigadier would be in charge of coming out and getting the flour and then bringing it back to those 150. But the brigadiers were all criminals, and they would come out, take the flour, and then not distribute it. And so no one got any flour, so no one could eat anything. And the people who did get flour rations mixed it with water, and then they would eat that raw, and it gave them dysentery, and then they died. Totally desperate, these deportees began constructing these crude rafts and began trying to cross the river to the other side, but many of them broke apart and they would drown in the freezing waters. And if they didn't drown, the guards would see them crossing and would take shots at them. And so if they didn't drown or get shot and they did make it to the other side, they'd be in the Siberian wasteland with no supplies and they would die there too. And so Nazino Island completely devolved into chaos. Almost immediately, cannibalism became a thing, and there were these roving gangs of people that were the strongest and fittest of the island who would just go around and murder the weak and eat them. And the guards that were watching this did nothing to stop it, and frankly couldn't if they wanted to, because you've now reached the absolute extremes of human survival. One local woman who would make an annual trip to Nazino Island before there were people being deported there made her annual trip and was shocked to see all these people on this island that normally had no one there. And she said from her boat, she watched this group of people run up on this woman, drag her to a tree, they tied her to the tree, and then began cutting off pieces of her while she was alive and eating it right in front of her. And then after the group had left, the woman who was tied to the tree was still alive, and what looked like her partner, her boyfriend, her husband comes over, tries to untie her, he tries to save her, but there's nothing he can do, and she dies in his arms. Another local who managed to save a woman from Nazino Island, she got her into her house and she sat her down, and she noticed that the backs of her legs were all bandaged up. And she asked her what was going on with the backs of her legs, and she undid her dressing, and her calf muscles on her legs were gone. Someone had cut them off and eaten them. Of the nearly 7,000 people that were sent to Nazino Island, only 2,000 remained at the end of the first month they were there. And in fact, when word got out to Stalin that this island had become Cannibal Island, he actually shut it down and moved the remaining 2,000 deportees to another labor camp where unfortunately many of them died as well. And sadly, those few thousand people only represent a fraction of the massive number of people that died during Stalin's many purges. Hisashi Ouchi was married, had a young son, he smoked a pack of cigarettes a day, he played rugby in high school, and by 1999 he was employed as a technician at the JCO Tokimura power plant. He and his colleagues had been tasked with creating the fuel for a fast reactor called Joyo. Since 1993, the company JCO that owns this power plant that Ouchi works for, they had been cutting a lot of corners to increase productivity and profitability, but at the expense of safety. In fact, the company had their own in-house rules that totally went against nuclear power plant regulations. They called this the Shadow Guide, and within the Shadow Guide, there were very specific steps that were totally unsafe and unregulated to create this fuel for this Joyo fast reactor. On September 30th, 1999, Ouchi was creating this Joyo fuel, and he was leaning over this large steel containment tank, and he was holding a funnel. One of his colleagues was above the tank, pouring in this potent solution through the funnel into the tank. The tank they were using, that was prescribed under the Shadow Guide, was not actually designed to hold the amount of radioactive materials that were being put inside of it. And so as Ouchi and his colleague are creating this mixture, a very dangerous event occurred known as criticality. criticality. One of the survivors who was sitting away from the tank behind a desk described this event as being an extremely loud bang followed by this blue flash that filled the entire room. And what that blue light was extremely high levels of radiation, and because Ouchi was the one kind of leaning over the tank, it all went right through him. By the time a rescue crew got in the room to help them, Ouchi is uncontrollably vomiting and he's lightheaded and dizzy. He does not have any physical wounds. This was not an explosion, so there's no lacerations or anything on his body. But he had been exposed to 17 sieverts of radiation, which is the highest amount of radiation any human being has ever been exposed to in documented history. Ouchi was airlifted to a hospital, and doctors and nurses were actually kind of amazed at how well he was doing in those first few days. Again, he did not have any burn marks or anything on his body. He did have a little bit of redness on his right arm, which was positioned directly over the tank when this criticality event occurred, but he was in good spirits and was even joking around with the staff about how he can't wait to get home. In reality, Ouchi died as soon as he was exposed to that criticality event and received 17 sieverts of radiation. He was in what's known as walking ghost phase, where due to high levels of radiation, all of his chromosomes had been obliterated, which meant his body did not have a blueprint to reproduce cells. So basically, he appeared alive and well because his body had created all of these cells in his body before the accident, but as those cells died off, they would not be reproduced, which means in walking ghost phase, your body is turning into a corpse, but you're alive to watch it happen. Tragically, after doctors discovered this about his condition and they informed Ouchi of what was going on, Ouchi did not seem to think there could be that serious of consequences for being exposed to that level of radiation. He felt like he was in the clear. He had made it past a couple of days. He thought maybe at worst he would develop leukemia later in life because he thought that was a thing with radiation. And really his concern was that he might have to stay in the hospital for a little bit longer. He just wanted to go home. 3 weeks after the accident, his intestines began to hemorrhage and his skin fell off. All of it. They attempted numerous skin grafts to try to keep his bodily fluids inside of him, but none of them took, so they began wrapping him in gauze like he was a mummy. By November 27th, which is 2 months after the accident, miraculously, he was still alive. However, his pain levels were so high, they had to put him into a medically induced coma. While he was in the coma, his heart would stop and he would need to be resuscitated 3 separate times. And on the 3rd time he was brought back, he would say, "Stop. Stop, get out of the room, leave me alone." But they didn't stop because the doctors and nurses were very interested in studying the effects of this level of radiation and how well he would respond to treatment, and just trying to learn as much as they could about this event because it had never happened before. And they probably justified it by saying this will save other people's lives. But what that meant is Ouchi would need to suffer unbelievable levels of pain. Nearing the end, when Ouchi could still speak, he told the doctors and nurses repeatedly that he is not a guinea pig. Finally, a do not resuscitate order was put in place, and in relative short order, Ouchi passed away after 83 days of just unbelievable agony. The truly famous picture that is associated with this story is unbelievably graphic, and I did not want to share it on this channel. However, if you feel so inclined, it's not that difficult to find online. This picture, however, is equally disturbing because it's of Ouchi right after he's arrived at the hospital. He is in that walking ghost phase. All of his chromosomes have been obliterated. He is effectively dead right now in this picture. From the outside, Bart Whitaker appeared to love his family. He and his younger brother Kevin were extremely close, and Bart and his father shared a passion for long-distance cycling and would often go out and bike around the neighborhood together. Bart's family would regularly go on vacation to places like Cancun, and the pictures of Bart with his family on these vacations are always him beaming with happiness and love for his family. On December 10th, 2003, Bart, who was 23, almost 24 years old at the time, made a special announcement to his family. He told his family that he had just finished taking his final exams of his senior year at nearby Sam Houston State College and that he was going to graduate. Bart was not a natural student and frankly struggled in college, and so this was a really big announcement, and the family was really excited for him, especially his parents. And so they said, we have to go out and celebrate. And so they went out to a restaurant, and they're having this really expensive, lavish dinner. And in fact, his parents had bought a really nice Rolex watch to give to Bart if he were to graduate college. And so here he is announcing it, and they thought, you know what, now's a good time to give it to him. They give him his Rolex, and they're asking people at nearby tables to take their pictures, and everybody just seems so happy, and the parents are so proud of Bart. After they finish dinner, they're all smiles, they pile back in the family car, and they start making their drive back to Sugar Land, Texas, where the Whitaker residence was. It was inside of this upper-class suburb about 40 minutes away from Houston, Texas. On the drive home, his parents are endlessly talking about how proud they are of Bart and how excited they are for his future. They get back to their house, they pull in the driveway, and Bart's brother and parents make their way up to the front door. Bart is behind them, and he says, "Hey, I forgot something in the car." He turns around and goes back to the car as his brother and his parents walk into the house and are immediately gunned down by an assassin waiting inside of the Whitaker residence. Bart hears the shooting and runs back inside the house. He sees his family is down. He ends up wrestling with the shooter, who ends up shooting him but hits him in the arm before escaping the house. A neighbor hears the shooting and runs outside and sees this chaotic scene. They call 911. Police show up, and Bart's brother, Kevin, has passed away, as well as his mother. They both died on scene. As for Bart and Bart's father, they would go to the hospital and they would both make a full recovery. So this huge investigation is launched to figure out who this assassin was and why he was attacking the Whitaker family. And quickly they discovered that Bart Whitaker had hired him. Bart Whitaker wanted his family killed so he could take their money. And he had the assassin shoot him in the arm to make it look like, this was not his fault and he wasn't involved. Here's a picture from the night they were out celebrating Bart's big accomplishment that he had finished his final exams, except Bart was a total liar and he had stopped going to classes ages ago. He was failing every class and was not even close to graduating. In this picture, Bart knows that the assassin he hired is currently sitting in their house, waiting for them to return when he is going to open fire and kill Bart's family. The people in this picture with him are going to be murdered literally hours later, and he knows it. Bart was convicted in 2007 for hiring the hitman and was given the death penalty, but 40 minutes before his execution, the governor of Texas commuted his sentence to a life sentence because, oddly enough, Bart's own father, one of the people he tried to have killed, had forgiven him and did not want to see his last remaining family member be executed. In 2013, Philip Chisholm was a 14-year-old high school student going to school in Danvers, Massachusetts. He lived at home with his single mother. Classmates described Chisholm as being quiet, a bit of a loner. He was a great student, and he was the leading scorer of his soccer team. On October 22nd, 2013, Chisholm missed soccer practice in the afternoon and then missed a team dinner that night, at which point his teammates tried calling and texting him. He didn't get back to them, so they got in touch with his mother. She tried reaching out to him to no avail, and so she contacted the police and said, "My son is missing." On the same night that Chisholm is reported missing, one of his teachers, 24-year-old Colleen Ritzer, doesn't come home from work. Her family and her friends try reaching out to her, texting her, calling her, no response, so they too go to the police and they report her missing as well. The police were already looking for Chisholm, so when they hear one of his teachers is also missing, they assume they must be linked, and so they go to the high school, even though it's well after hours, to see if maybe there's some clues there. They search the high school, and Chisholm is not there, and neither is Miss Ritzer, but when they're looking in the girls' restroom that was right next to Miss Ritzer's classroom, they find a small splash of blood. Even though at the time they had no way of knowing if this blood was connected to Chisholm or Miss Ritzer, they decided they would pull all the security footage for the past 24 hours that was looking in the direction of this bathroom. And they make a startling discovery starting at the 2:54 p.m. mark on October 22nd, the day they went missing. This is Miss Ritzer walking down the hall towards the bathroom that had blood in it. This is Chisholm following Miss Ritzer into the hall. He's looking hesitant. He doesn't really know what he's going to do. He's thinking about following her. And at some point he says, "You know what? I am going to do this." He goes back into the classroom, re-emerges with his hood on, and walks down the hall towards the bathroom where Miss Ritzer is. This is Chisholm entering the girls' bathroom with surgical gloves on. 11 minutes later, Chisholm would leave the bathroom. Miss Ritzer would still be inside. Chisholm would leave school property, he would run outside, he would get a big recycling bin, and then he would wheel that back into the school, and then he would go back into the bathroom with the recycling bin. At 3:21 p.m., 26 minutes after Chisholm had first entered the girls' bathroom after Miss Ritzer, he re-emerges, now wearing a full face mask. He doesn't have a sweatshirt on anymore, and he's pulling along this recycling bin that looks noticeably heavier than when he brought it in. And that's because Miss Ritzer's body is now stuffed inside of it. Police were able to locate Miss Ritzer's body using the surveillance cameras on the outside of the school. They just watched what he did with the recycling bin, and he didn't bring it very far away from the school. Police were able to quickly track Chisholm down and arrest him because as soon as he was done attacking Miss Ritzer, he used her credit card to go to a movie theater in town and watched a movie. So he's on security cameras watching the movie, and the police were tracking her credit cards because they noticed they were stolen, and they saw that he had swiped the card at this movie theater. So he gets arrested and he's given a life sentence. Here is the footage of Chisholm leaving the girls' bathroom with Miss Ritzer's body inside of that recycling bin. His motives remain unclear, but he claims she used what he called a trigger word that really upset him. Following World War II, the Soviet Union began investing heavily into nuclear power, and by 1977, the V.I. Lenin nuclear power station located in Chernobyl, Ukraine, was finally operational. The station itself was comprised of 4 reactors that were each labeled 1, 2, 3, and 4. On April 25, 1986, a group of very sleep-deprived plant workers began running a series of routine tests on nuclear reactor number 4. They were trying to see if the reactor could still be cooled even in the event of a complete power loss. But during the test, perhaps because they were sleep-deprived and just didn't feel like doing it, they started cutting corners and violated a number of safety protocols that led to several surges of power inside of the reactor. This led to a chain reaction of explosions within reactor number 4 that culminated in a massive explosion that blew the lid off the building, exposing the reactor's core. It would take the Soviets 10 days to finally stop the fire that was raging inside of this exposed core, which meant for those 10 days, radiation on an unprecedented level was spewed into the environment by this fire. But even after the fire was controlled, you have all this radioactive material that needs to be properly disposed of. And so the Soviets started by using robots to go up and pick up these materials and dispose of them, but the robots were breaking down from the high levels of radiation. And so naturally the Soviets sent in groups of men to go pick up the material, and dozens of people died from radiation sickness. A few months after the explosion, the first steel sarcophagus was built around reactor number 4 to try to contain some of that radiation. But even with that protection, it's estimated that the area around Chernobyl will not be habitable for another 20,000 years. So as a result, the Soviet Union created what they call an exclusion zone, which is 19 miles all around Chernobyl that no one can go inside of. And so nature's kind of reclaimed this area that used to be a fairly bustling metropolis. 1 year after the disaster, Ukrainian containment crews finally broke into the steam corridor that was located underneath the molten remains of reactor number 4. And as soon as they stepped in, their radiation readers spiked all the way to the top. And so they know that whatever's at the other end of this L-shaped hallway is something they did not want to get close to. And so they put a camera on a chair with wheels, and they pushed it down the hall to where it finally broke that corner and had a clear line of sight to the other end. And using a timer on the camera, they were able to take a picture of one of the single most dangerous things in the entire world. It became known as the elephant's foot. It was a molten pile of nuclear fuel and melted metal and sand and concrete that had all kind of converged and seeped through a pipe meant for steam and found its way into the basement. It was and still is emitting the equivalent level of radiation of 4.5 million chest x-rays every hour. Today, if you were to stand in front of the elephant's foot without proper equipment for 30 seconds, your cells would start to hemorrhage and you would become viciously ill, and you could even die. At 2 minutes of exposure, you're definitely going to die. But not right away. You have 48 hours and there's nothing you can do to stop it. You are 100% going to die. Armin Meiwes seemed like a really good guy. He mowed his neighbor's lawn, he offered to fix his friends' cars, he would host these great dinner parties at his house. But underneath that charming outer layer, Armin Meiwes was a deeply disturbed individual. In 2001, Armin would place an ad on the internet seeking a young, well-built man that is looking to be slaughtered and then consumed. Meiwes actually got a lot of replies to this, and people acted like they were interested, but I think people were just responding because it was such an outrageous thing he was asking for, so no one went through with it. Until a man named Bernard Brandes saw it, who had previously placed an ad on the internet himself, asking if there was anybody out there that would slaughter and eat him. So perfect match. So Brandes reaches out to Armin and says, yes, I'd love to. And on March 9th, 2001, the two meet up at Armin's house. Brandes lays down in the bathtub while Armin sets up a video camera. He wants to film this for a variety of reasons, but mostly he wants to make sure that everybody sees that Brandes is doing this willingly. On camera, Brandes gives Armin the go-ahead. Initially, Armin tries biting into Brandes, but apparently he was too chewy, so Brandes suggests he gets a knife. After successfully removing a piece of Brandes, Armin fries it up in a pan, and the two of them begin to eat it. But apparently it was too burned to either of their liking, and they would feed that piece of him to the dog. At this point, Brandes is in and out of consciousness because he's losing a lot of blood, so Armin decides to take a break and go to his room and read a Star Trek book. When Armin goes back in the bathroom, it's clear that Brandes is still alive, but he's on the verge of death. So, after much deliberation and quite a bit of praying, Armin ultimately ends Brandes' life and then proceeds to butcher him and put all of his meat into a freezer. Over the next 10 months, Armin would consume over 44 pounds of Brandes. In December of 2001, Armin put another ad online seeking somebody else that wanted to be eaten, and that ad would get sent to the police, who would go to Armin's house. They would find Brandes' remains behind pizza boxes in the back of his freezer, and they would arrest Armin. Despite showing police the videotape that showed Brandes repeatedly consenting to what was happening to him, Armin was still given a life sentence. This is the picture that Brandes put online in hopes that it would attract someone that would want to eat him. And this is the bathtub where Armin Meiwes would grant Brandes that wish.